Hi, my name is Eric Williams, and I'm the rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Rochester, Michigan. And I'm pleased to present this series of lectures and classes on the Bible. We're calling it Bible 101, and it's really a class designed to introduce people to the Bible. Many of us have an old family Bible sitting in our homes. Sometimes it's on a shelf, sometimes it's covered with dust. And it's intimidating. The Bible is a book that is very difficult to find our way into. Some of us grow up in the church and we hear Bible passages read, but they're usually read out of context. We hear snippets, but we don't know where how they fit together, where they fit into the story of God's people. And if we didn't grow up in the church, then the Bible seems like a very odd book, a collection of words that are often our old family Bibles are often in a version of English that's hard for us to understand. Um, and so we are intimidated. We don't open it up. We don't get into it. We don't read it. And so the purpose of this class is to give you a way into the Bible, to understand a little bit more about how the Bible was written, what's in the Bible, how do we try to approach what's in the Bible, what are the types of writings and wisdom and literature that are there, how did it come to be put together, and what does it really mean for us? And so I welcome you to this class and hope that you find it helpful in your journey. These classes will be offered in person on Thursday nights, usually the third Thursday of the month, starting September 2024. But I'm also going to give each lecture online as well because not everyone can be present for every class, and some people find this format a little bit more conducive. And so, whether you're joining us in person or online, I welcome you and invite you to contact me if you have questions or thoughts along the way. So, let's get started. So, our first session for this Bible 101 class is how the Bible was written. And the in-person version of this will be on September 19th, 2024 at 7 p.m. I want to start by finding out from you, either in person or online, what are the questions that you bring to this class? What are you hoping to find out? And what are you most interested in learning about? What are your goals, in other words, for this class? We'll be doing this in the in-person class on whiteboard and writing down these questions because I fully intend to answer each question throughout the course of the series of lectures. Um, but if you're doing this online, obviously we can't record them there. So send me an email to ericw@stpfeeds.org, and I will do my best to incorporate your questions into the class as we go along. And feel free to do that as we go along. I think hopefully some of the classes will spark questions. And again, if you're just watching this at home, I want to make sure that you also have the opportunity to ask those questions and have them answered. So we often assume, I think, if we are growing up in Western civilization, that the Bible somehow just dropped out of heaven just as it is, as a fully formed book. The old joke is, if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Um, but we get a much richer understanding and appreciation of the Bible if we look back through the centuries to see how, in fact, the Bible was put together, who wrote it, and why. The events that are recorded in the Bible include the growth of the early Christian church in the first centuries of its existence, the life and teachings of Jesus, and the long history of the people of Israel, and even the creation of the universe. That's the history in the Bible. But the history of the Bible is also fascinating. The Bible itself has a history. And by learning that history, we can gain insight into how to read and interpret it. So, first of all, why is the Bible called the Bible? Um, the word biblion, from Greek, from the which we get the word Bible, literally means paper or scroll, and ultimately came to be the common word used for book. So, in a way, when we say the Bible, we're saying the book. Um, by the second century before the Common Era, Jewish groups began calling the books of the Bible scriptures, also basically means writings, and they refer to them as holy. So in Hebrew, that would be Kitvei HaKodesh, which was a way of saying that this book, these writings, were special in some way, set apart for special study and for inspiration. The Bible was divided into chapters, you may be shocked to learn, only in the 13th century by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who was a biblical scholar and wanted an easier way of referring to parts of the Bible. So think about that. There were no chapters until very, very late. And it wasn't divided into verses until the 16th century by a French printer named Robert Etienne. And it's now usually cited when we talk about a verse in the Bible or a part of it, we're going to refer to it by chapter and verse. We're so used to that, we don't even think about it. But these had to be invented. As we'll see, even the punctuation of the Bible, even the vowels that are used in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible had to be added later on. It's a fascinating, the more you dig in to the history of the Bible, the more layers and interest and fascination and mystery there is. So the division of the Hebrew Bible into verses um, is really based on a mark that was used by medieval Jewish scholars called the Masoretes. They're really important in the history of the Bible to record the verse divisions. And those were probably based on an oral tradition that predated the Middle Ages. They were borrowing from that, but then kind of codifying it for those earlier written Bibles in the Middle Ages. So let's talk about the earliest manuscripts. So manuscripts are just the first kinds of scratching on the surface, um, because many of the stories in the Bible come to us from oral tradition. These were stories passed down in the ancient world from teachers to students, parents to children, and kept going through that unwritten oral tradition. But the earliest manuscripts are important as we kind of figure out how did the Bible get to be the way it is today. One of the issues that we have with manuscripts is it's very hard for them to be preserved. Like many of the materials that people used for the written word did not survive the test of time. A lot of that is lost. I wonder sometimes with our technological methods of communication, whether anything will be preserved from this generation in the future. Like emails, like how are people going to go back? And we don't have written letters. Like you think of so many historians poring over people's letters. How are they going to access people's emails? It'll be a challenge for future historians. The earliest New Testament manuscripts were written on papyrus. They took the papyrus plants and they pounded them into a kind of paper. It was a reed that grew in Egypt in the Nile Delta. And that papyrus was used as late as the 8th century of the Common Era. Papyrus, though, becomes brittle as it ages and it deteriorates. So we're lucky that Egypt had a very dry climate, and many of those papyri were partially preserved, but we don't have any complete New Testament manuscript on papyrus. Many are just a single page um, and maybe just fragments. And then insects sometimes would get into them, and preserving those early papyri was very, very difficult. Beginning in the 4th century, parchment began to be used, or vellum. Those were two different, newer ways of preserving writing. Vellum often from like calf skin that would be pounded flat and made into a kind of book. Um, we don't get what we think of as paper, like modern paper, until the 12th century, and it's an invention from China, which began to gain popularity and later got put into books, which were called codices. The earliest Bible manuscripts, of course, are not written in English. Um, they are written in Paleo-Hebrew. That's the precursor to Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, which was a common language in the time of Jesus, in Greek, in Syriac, and in Latin. And so Bible translators and Bible scholars are piecing together partial manuscripts that have been preserved in different places in different languages. And that's what they're using to put together some of the earliest complete Bibles that we think of. As I mentioned earlier, manuscripts were not even in book form, but in fragments of papyrus and parchment. Um, the first printed Bible, so this is a technological innovation. We think of modern technological innovations like the internet or like artificial intelligence. But one of the most important technological innovations in human history was the invention of the movable type printing press, pioneered by Gutenberg in Germany and others, which allowed for the first time for the rapid and inexpensive publication of books to the masses. Before that, books were incredibly expensive, hand copied, usually by monks in a monastery, and very rare and very expensive. But after the 15th century, now we have access to inexpensive books that can be published quickly and disseminated quickly. It's one of the reasons the Protestant Reformation gained such a foothold, because the ideas could be spread so quickly through this new medium of the printing press. So, what are the sources of the Bible? When we think of where does it come from, it would be nice if we had a perfect original version of the Bible, but no such thing exists, or at least has never been found. What we do know is some of the history of those fragments and papyri and pages that have been kept down through history. The original sources are harder to pin down, right? We know those texts and where they came from, but where were the original sources? So, as I mentioned, oral tradition and storytelling are the main source of the original stories of the Bible. And those were circulating among the people of Israel for more than 1,000 years before many of them were written down. So think, for example, of the beautiful story of creation in Genesis chapter 1. We don't have an eyewitness to the story of creation, right? If what we have are the legends, the myths, the ideas of that being passed down through the generations until finally the first writings of the Hebrew Bible are really recorded around 1000 BCE, before the Common Era, in the court of King David. That's some of the first written parts of the Hebrew Bible are 1000 BCE. And they put together all kinds of stuff. They have scribes that are recording what's happening with King Saul and King David and King Solomon. So we get kind of an eyewitness view, contemporary view of their reigns, which has a really interesting flavor. If you read the first and second books of Samuel and the first and second book of Kings, you get a very sort of contemporary view of what was happening in the courts and in the histories. But they're also writing down these oral traditions that have been passed down, like the stories of Genesis, the stories of creation, the stories of the patriarchs, um, the story of Joseph and Jacob and the 12 tribes. All of those ancient stories have been passed on orally, and now they're written down for the first time. And in the New Testament, the earliest written texts that we have are the letters of St. Paul that he begins to write about 50 of the Common Era. So those are the sources that we're really looking at. So let's get a little timeline here. I hope you can see this all right, of when these different parts of the Bible were written, right? Not when the events happened necessarily, but when these things are written down, just a kind of quick snapshot. So as I mentioned, the first parts of the Hebrew Bible begin to be written around 1000 BCE, around the time of King David. And almost all of what we consider the books of the Hebrew or Old Testament are written between 1000 and 400 BCE. So ancient stories passed down by oral tradition, and then 600 years of the history of the people of Israel being recorded, the prophets and the writings and everything we consider part of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is really written during that time. The next major event in the writing of the Bible was that these Hebrew, mostly Hebrew and Paleo-Hebrew texts are not understandable by people by around 250 BCE because no one's speaking Hebrew anymore. The language of the intelligentsia, the language of the people who are reading and writing is Greek. And so the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, into a version that's called the Septuagint, a really important document because this becomes the common Bible that Jews have starting from 200, let's say 200 BCE. This is the Bible that Jesus knew. This is the Bible that St. Paul knew. This is the Bible that the earliest Christians were reading and quoting. And so when you see quotations from the Old Testament in the New Testament, it is quotations really from the Septuagint, from this Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And then there's this fascinating period from about 300 BCE to about 100 CE, the Common Era. Um, I'll talk about this in a second, but we use different uh, words for that. And when I was a kid, we talked about BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. Um, Current scholars really prefer before the Common Era and the Common Era. It's more neutral language. So I'm mostly using that language. I may slip up and use the old language sometimes. But this period of about 400 years, 300 years before Jesus and 100 years after, is a period when a fascinating group of books are written called the Apocrypha. Apocrypha means sort of hidden knowledge, and they're also called, because we need big words, the deuterocanonical books are written. These are the books that don't make it into the official Bible, but are books that are really, really fascinating to read and understand. And we'll spend some time on them later in this course because they're really, really fascinating. They tend to take a sort of philosophical view of religion and ask some of the big questions. And they're really helpful in understanding this period of time right before, a lot of it right before the coming of Jesus. And then the books of the New Testament are largely written from around 45 of the Common Era, when St. Paul starts writing his letters, to about 120 of the Common Era, when the final books of the New Testament are written, things like First and Second Timothy, Revelation, even the Gospel of John may be that late. So there's this span, a much shorter span, but a span of about 80 years when the books of the New Testament are being put together in Greek. So we have no Bible yet, though. There's all these different books. Some of them eventually make it into the Bible and some don't. Some of them are the Hebrew or Greek versions of the Hebrew Bible. Some of them are the Apocrypha. Some of them are the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and some other books and letters. And so basically, people had to get together and decide, all right, what are we going to include in what we consider the official Bible? And so there were two councils of rabbis. So a major event happens in 70 of the Common Era. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans, and all of Jewish worship has to change from being temple worship, the sacrifice of animals, all the festivals, the holy days. It changes to becoming a much more dispersed religion. And so instead of a temple, there are now synagogues. People are worshiping at home, they're worshiping in smaller communities, and they need a Bible to because that becomes the focus now of their religion, of Jewish religion, is the Torah, reading, understanding, commenting on the Torah, the Bible. And so councils in Jamnia of rabbis in the year 90 and 118 codify, they basically put together the list of books that are the official Hebrew Bible. And that's a really important thing that happens. It's weird to think about a time before they knew which ones were official and which ones weren't. They're reading these books, they're passing them around, but is it official or not official? These councils kind of give the stamp of approval. These are the official books. In 140 or 150, there is the first version of an official New Testament. A um, a scholar named Marcion, who later is condemned as a heretic, he comes up with a Bible that he thinks is official, and the church bishops and fathers are offended by this, and so they decide to create their own version. And so they come up with a series of lists of books that are the official New Testament. In the years 303 to 306, there were different waves of persecution by different Roman emperors. Diocletian's persecution confiscates and destroys Christian scriptures. And so in 305 to 310, a man named Lucian of Antioch, he creates a Greek New Testament text, and it becomes the foundation for later versions of the New Testament. By 367, St. Athanasius, a great scholar and a leader of the church, he, in a letter, lists the complete, what we consider now the complete New Testament canon, and I'll mention what that is in just a second. But the official list of the New Testament books that we still have, that's listed for the first time in 367. So that's 367, well, 330 years or so after the resurrection of Christ. It takes 300 years for us to have an official New Testament version. In 397, all the bishops at the Council of Carthage codify that list and make it the New Testament as we know it. And then in 400 or so, around then, St. Jerome translates this Greek version of the New Testament into Latin. And we'll talk about that's called the Vulgate, and that becomes the basis for Western Christianity from that time forward. So what I want you to see in this is just the kind of progression of a whole loose collection of writings, oral tradition that gets written down. All these writings are being shared. And then eventually, over time, they get put into an official list into what we now know as the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. So when I talk about the word canon, the biblical canon or canon of scripture is a set of books or a set of texts that are considered authoritative. There was a big debate when I was in college over What Should Be Taught in Western Civilization Courses. I don't know if you remember this. There was a book called The Closing of the American Mind by Bloom, and um, I'm trying to remember his name. There was a politician who was on, I think, in Reagan's cabinet, Bennett, who was really pushing that we codify a list of what educated Americans should read and should know, right? We should have a list, a canon that is considered sort of authoritative. Like any educated person should have read these things. You know, should have read the Odyssey, and a lot of us had that those kind of books in school, and it was really controversial because there were new things, and should we include more books by women and by African American and Asian American, Latin American authors? Like who should be in the canon and who should be not in the canon? Was a big issue. Uh, how long ago? 40 years ago, in American schools and universities. Well, this is the issue for the Bible. What is the authoritative list of what is scripture? What is considered set apart and holy and important for all Jews or all Christians to read? The word canon really comes from rule or measuring stick. So, what's the measuring stick? What's the rule? What's the standard by which we're going to judge whether a religious writing is in the Bible and canon or not in the Bible and non-canonical? So there are a variety of variations of the canon over the years. Um, and interestingly, Christian communities still disagree about the books that should be included or excluded. So, for example, if you buy a version of the Bible, let's say like the New International Version is probably the most popular among evangelical Christians and Protestants, and that version of the Bible does not include those apocryphal books. Remember the books written between 300 BCE and 100 CE, whereas the New Revised Standard Version, which Episcopal churches tend to use, includes those books, right? So if you go to the bookstore and you buy a Bible, there are different Bibles depending on who's producing those Bibles and what they want included. Find that really fascinating. And it goes to this issue of what is canonical, what is authoritative, and what is not. So, what about those books that didn't make it in the Bible? What about those interesting oddball books? So, these apocryphal or deuterocanonical, it just means the second canon, there's the official list and then list B. Those are books like Tobit that appeared in the Greek version of the Old Testament, right? So when it was translated into Greek, some books were included in that. But the Masoretes, who were these Hebrew scholars of the Middle Ages, did not include it in their Hebrew version. So the Greek Old Testament has these books, the Hebrew version does not. What do we do with them? How do we treat them? How do we think about them? And as I mentioned, many Protestant churches do not accept them as part of the Bible. There were also, in the early centuries, remember the list of books doesn't get codified until 397 of New Testament books. So for a few hundred years, there's a lot of change and growth in the Christian church. And there were a number of people who had kind of far out ideas. We call them now the Gnostics, the wise ones. And they were condemned as being heretics by the bishops of the Catholic Church. And so these Gnostic groups were producing their own writings in the years from 100 to 300, and they wanted those books in the Bible. There's several Gospels that aren't in the four Gospels. So there's the Gospel of Thomas, there's writings of Paul and Thecla, there's all these fascinating things. There was one in the news, the what was it, the Gospel of Judas or something like that, that someone had claimed to find. Anyway, these are all later Gnostic writings. And when the church bishops got together in 397, they're like, no, these do not date from the time of Jesus and the apostles. They don't say the same things about Jesus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. And so they cannot be included. And so that was one of the big early church debates, was what is official and um, kosher and what is not, what is heretical. And so they were banned by the early church. In fact, the early church tried to destroy any copies they found of those books. But we know about them because of what's called the Nag Hammadi Library, also called the Gnostic Gospels, because a group of these manuscripts was found in Egypt, remember, preserved in that very dry climate in 1945. And so that was a watershed year because all of a sudden people and scholars found these books and were like, what is this? And it gave us a window into really the intellectual ferment that was going on in the early church in those early centuries. Another amazing find around that same time were the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they've researchers, there was a fascinating story about these Qumran caves. This shepherd boy stumbled into he was looking for something in the cave and fell through the floor and found these containers, clay jars that had in them these scrolls. And these scrolls are some of the earliest versions of the Hebrew Bible that we have ever found. They were discovered in two groups in 1946 and then in 1956 in 11 different caves near the Dead Sea. That's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, a very dry climate, which was helpful in preserving these ancient manuscripts. The Qumran community is a fascinating one. It may have been connected to the radical sect called the Essenes. Some people think John the Baptist was part of one of those communities. Um, and they went out and lived in the desert in these caves near in the West Bank of what's now the West Bank of Israel. They're, as I said, about a mile from the Dead Sea. And most scholars believe that these scrolls come from that same period as the Apocrypha, the last 3 centuries before Christ and the first century after. So basically that same period of apocryphal writings. But some of these texts, which were copied over, go back, even long, long before that and show us some of the earliest surviving manuscripts of some of the books that we know, like the prophet Isaiah. There's a really great version of the prophet Isaiah. And what's interesting is when scholars compared this very ancient papyrus or scroll from Isaiah to what the Masoretes had copied in the 10th century, way, way, way later, they found almost a um, perfect, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, they agreed almost perfectly, word for word. And so we have great confidence in the work of the Masoretes as they were putting the Hebrew Bible together, that they were really keeping true to their errors, their interesting glitches, differences between different manuscripts, copying errors, that kind of thing. But largely, these books really were passed on very precisely and accurately over the centuries. Um, so anyway, this is a really interesting find. There's a shrine now in Jerusalem. In 1965, the state of Israel built a museum, the Israel Museum, to house these, the Shrine of the Book. The top there is designed to look like the cap of um, those ceramic jars that contain the manuscripts. And so the whole museum is meant to look like that. You go down into the museum and it's all climate controlled, and you can see these original Dead Sea Scrolls. It was when we went on our pilgrimage several years ago, to me, it was one of the more moving places we went to see these ancient manuscripts, to see these words of the Hebrew Bible preserved for so long, and now to be in the same place. It was just absolutely stunning. Yeah, it's just amazing. Okay, moving along. So the Hebrew Bible, we've been talking a lot about the Hebrew Bible. The Jewish term for that is Tanakh. And Tanakh is a kind of acronym which tells you that there are three sections to the Hebrew Bible. The first and most important is the Torah, T, literally means instruction or law, and it contains the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. By tradition, these were the books dictated by Moses, although Deuteronomy ends with a description of Moses' death and burial, so it's kind of hard to think that Moses wrote that part. But later scholars think it was the work of many people over time that put these books together. But it is the basis for Jewish belief, thought, and practice to this day. The Torah is the essence of Jewish faith. And the second section, major section of the Tanakh, is the N word, TNK. So the N is Nevi'im, which means prophets. And so a big chunk of the Hebrew Bible are the prophets. There are the major prophets, which simply means the longer books, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then the minor prophets, like Amos and Obadiah, Nahum, and so forth. And so that's the second major part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And then the third part are the writings. And these tend to be a little bit later. They overlap a little bit to me with the Apocrypha. Some of the issues, like the book of Job, is a wonderful philosophical book, which asks the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Question that we still ask today. Well, Job is a whole essay on that very question, and examines the problem from all different angles. And so it's a very, very much a philosophical book influenced by, I'm sure, Greek philosophy at the time as well. So those are the three main sections of the Hebrew Bible: the law, the prophets, and the writings. And the word Tanakh simply gives you a little way of seeing that. I won't go into much depth on this slide, but it basically shows you all the earliest versions of the Tanakh that we have. So we have very, very early, from around 587 BCE, these little amulets that are written in Paleo Hebrew called the Silver Scrolls, which have some fragments. Then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date from about 150 BCE and also have fragments. Then we have the Septuagint. So composed around 300 BCE, or between 300 and 100. We have fragments of it from the 2nd century BCE, and the first complete version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, we have in the 4th century CE. Then we have the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible, and that is dated from the 5th century CE. And we have a complete one from the 8th century. And then the Masoretic texts. Remember, these are the great scholars who essentially invented a system for adding vowels to the Hebrew Bible. Really fascinating. Anyway, you get the sense. Then there's the Samaritan Pentateuch. Pentateuch is another word for Torah. It means 5 books. And so we have that in Samaritan Hebrew. We've got the Targum, which is an Aramaic version of the Bible from the 5th century. And then we have Coptic or Egyptian Christian versions from the 3rd or 4th century. So we've got all these different sort of sources. Some are fragments, some are complete, but you can see it takes a long time for these versions to kind of become complete and be passed down to us. And that's the source. That's what we're basing our English Bibles are all based on, the work of scholars piecing together all these different elements. The work of Bible translation is complicated and fascinating and requires a lot of balancing of, is this the oldest fragment? Is this a more complete fragment? Which one do I use? If there's a discrepancy or difference, do I go with the oldest one or do I go with the more complete one? How do I figure that out? I find that really, really interesting. So I mentioned the Masoretes several times. Who are the Masoretes? So these were Jewish scribes or Jewish scholars who worked between the 6th and 10th century CE. They were based mostly in Palestine, around Jerusalem, and in Iraq, which was then called Babylonia. And they compiled a system because the earliest fragments of the Hebrew Bible just have consonants. Think about that for a second. No vowels, no punctuation, no capital letters. Everything is a capital letter and it's a consonant. And so, how do you piece that together and make sense of it? Well, the Masoretes figured out a way of adding vowels so that later people could, because the writer knew what they were doing. It's kind of a shorthand, but the Masoretes figured out how to add vowels and punctuation, these little marks. Um, so it's interesting that there's a verse in the New Testament where Jesus is talking about, I've not come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. Truly, I tell you, not one jot or tittle. What's a jot or a tittle? Well, these are the Masoretic marks, little a yod or they're little dots and commas that let you know where the vowels are and where the punctuation is. And Jesus said, not one of those is going to be taken away, um, which I find really interesting. Um, I won't go into much more about them, just to say that we are really indebted to the Masoretes for our understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Um, and that's the Masoretic version is the one that I studied in seminary. I took 2 years of Hebrew, and we had our Bible, and of course you read it right to left. So you flip the book backwards and flip it and go through, and we had a lot of fun trying to do our own translations of, for example, the Psalms and talk about it and debate why we translated things a certain way. But it was the Masoretic version that we used because that's considered the most complete and the most useful. So I mentioned St. Jerome. This photograph is a picture I took in Bethlehem. St. Jerome lived in Bethlehem. He had a cave where he spent his life. He was a monastic and a scholar. And so he took it upon himself to translate the entire Bible from, he had the Greek version of the Septuagint, and he had Hebrew and Greek versions, and he translated it all into Latin because by the 4th century, especially in the West, so in Europe, um, Greek is no longer being spoken, but Latin is. There's a divide that takes place in Christendom. The Eastern Orthodox, what we call now the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, they're still using Greek. In the West, they're using Latin. And so the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation, becomes the common Bible for Christians in the West and the basis for many of our English translations as well. By the 13th century, it was the commonly used version of the Bible, and it was affirmed as the official Catholic Bible at the Council of Trent when the Catholic Church was trying to say, okay, who are we as opposed to these Protestants? We have this, the Vulgate is our Catholic Bible. And so all Catholic Bibles have really traced their heritage from the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible. What about English? The earliest English Bibles. This is a picture of one of the early versions of the English Bible from Tyndale in 1526. English translations really occur from about the year 1500 to 1800. This is the period of early modern English. So not Middle English or Old English. This is now early modern English like Shakespeare. The first major period of Bible translation begins with William Tyndale in 1526. There was an earlier version that was written, at least parts of the New Testament, by John Wycliffe in the 14th century. But he was condemned as a heretic. It was illegal to translate the Bible into English, and he was allowed to retire and not be killed. But it was still, even in Tyndale's day, very risky to translate the Bible. And in fact, Tyndale is killed in France, arrested and killed for the crime of translating the Bible. He becomes a martyr for the early Protestants who come just after him. So Tyndale used the Greek and Hebrew texts of the New Testament and Old Testament and began to publish English versions. He completed a New Testament and published that, and was able to get it published now because of the new printing press. But he didn't quite finish the Old Testament. The first English translation of the whole Bible came from Miles Coverdale in 1535. He used Tyndale's work, and then he also added his own translations, particularly beautiful translations of the Psalms. Um, Coverdale's Psalter was the basis for the King James Bible later on, and I think still some of the loveliest English versions of the Psalms. Um, so Coverdale, his Bible is 1539. There's a new one that comes out in 1560 called the Geneva Bible. This is now the time of the Protestant Reformation, and Geneva is a center for Protestants. That's where John Calvin establishes his Christian kingdom. The Geneva Bible is the first English Bible that has verses. The Anglicans by this point, and we won't go into all the history of the Protestant Reformation, but so the more Protestant Puritans liked the Geneva Bible. So the Church of England under Elizabeth decided we needed an Anglican version, which she called the Bishop's Bible. So she was trying to get an authorized version. And then her successor, King James I, he commissions a group to produce what later becomes the authorized version of the Bible, or the King James version of the Bible. There's some funny moments. There's the Great Bible of 1539. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but um, the that's it's called the Great Bible because it was so big. The printing of it was so big. Um, so yeah, let's do a little of the history. So Wycliffe creates a partial translation in the 14th century that's condemned as heretical. Tyndale in 1525 completes the English Bible. That is suppressed by Henry VIII for its, I love this, pestilent glosses. How dare you interpret things? Henry VIII at that point was still a loyal Catholic defender of the faith, and so he suppressed the Tyndale's Bible. Coverdale's Great Bible in 1539 is suppressed by Queen Mary. So it's this whole period of Bible translation is very political and very controversial. The Geneva Bible is the Protestant version, as I mentioned, the Bishop's Bible, the Anglican version. There's a clandestine Roman Catholic version in 1582 called the Douay Rheims Bible. But finally, we get what's often considered the greatest English Bible, which is the King James Version, or the authorized version. So instructions were given by King James I to the translators that they were to not allow Puritan influences on this new translation. The Bishop of London added a qualification that the translators would add no marginal notes, so no little editorial comments. So he didn't like that. Further, the king gave the translators instructions to guarantee that the new version would follow the churchmanship of the new Church of England. Certain Greek and Hebrew words were to be translated in a manner that reflected the use of the church. For example, the word church itself, instead of gathering or community, we're going to call it the church because we want to support the structure of the Church of England with traditional beliefs about ordained clergy. James's instructions included requirements that kept the new translation familiar to listeners and readers. And let's see what else. I think that's plenty on that. So this becomes the basis for almost all versions of English Bibles going forward. It has an amazing impact on the Church of England, but also on the English-speaking world. And to this day, there are churches that believe that this is still the Bible. There are some Protestant churches which don't believe we should use any other translation than the authorized version. Sometimes they'll even call it the St. James Bible, which is hilarious because while King James was many things, a saint was not one of them. It's called the King James Bible because he was the king who authorized its translation and publication. So anyway, that's the we'll see in the next slide how the different English versions have proceeded from there. This is like a family tree of English translations of the Bible. I won't spend too much time, but here's like Wycliffe's Bible and Tyndale. Here's the Great Bible. Here's the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible. Here's the King James Version. So from the King James Version come all of these other English translations. There's first the English Revised Version, which becomes the American Standard Version, and then the Bible that I grew up with, which was called the Revised Standard Version. So it's definitely in the family of the King James Bible, but modernized. And that was around, I want to say the 1940s, maybe 50s. Um, that becomes the new Revised Standard Version that we use at St. Philip's, and there are some updates to it. But there are many other versions as well. There's the New King James Version of the Bible, which was an attempt to follow the structure of the King James Bible, but just update some of the scholarship, because we learn more through archaeology, and some of the words that we translated in one way don't make any sense. You'll see, if I can see my own notes here, um, you'll see the Jewish Publishing Society's Tanakh. That's their updated version of the Hebrew Bible based on scholarship. The New American Standard Bible, which I believe is a Catholic version of the Bible. The Living Bible, um, the English Standard Version. The NIV, the New International Version, is an attempt to break out of the structure of the King James Bible and to start over by translating the Greek and the Hebrew. In fact, many of these are attempts to go back to the original languages, but it's kind of in its own family here. And then there's the New American Bible and so forth. So you get an idea that different modern translations have their own kind of history that goes all the way back to the earliest versions of the Bible. So that is plenty of content for our first class. Um, I hope that you haven't found this terribly confusing. I know it can be very confusing, but the takeaways that I hope you will have from this first class are that the Bible itself, while it contains the history of the people of Israel and of the Christian church, also has a history of its own. It has a history that's made up of oral tradition and of the writings of many, many people over many, many centuries that have been recorded in fragments and scrolls and books, and then put together by later scholars and editors into the versions that we now have today. If you think of the Bible that you hold in your hands, maybe the Bible that you received at your confirmation, or a Bible that has been part of your family, I want you to think about the legacy of human endeavor that has led to that English translation of the Bible. All of those people inspired by God to remember and to tell the stories of creation, of the patriarchs, of the prophets, of Jesus and of the early church, and then all those people who courageously wrote those stories down. I think of St. Jerome in his cell, in his cave in Bethlehem, faithfully making sure that he could take those stories and then pass them on into this new language of Latin. I think of those courageous people like Tyndale and Coverdale, who, under threat of death, were willing to translate those Latin, Greek, and Hebrew words into English so that we might have access to these sacred stories. And I think of all those who have kept alive that biblical tradition, of inspiration and of faithfulness. I hope you get a sense that that the Bible is not a simple document. It's a library of books of different types, and we will spend the next sessions really digging into what's in those different things. What types of writings, and what do we learn about ourselves, and what do we learn about God? What do we learn about the world from these sacred writings? Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Bible 101.